Phew, I sure am tired from that 74 hours jog. Well, it's all worth it to maintain this dazzling musculature. And welcome back to Devlog. In the last part I worked on moving platforms, and in this part I work on being squished by moving platforms, being murdered. Being squished completely flat into a little small pancake by a funny moving object is imperative for good game design, but how doth one do such a thing? First we need to talk about the logic for how this works. We only need to check if the player is going to be squished by an object if objects are moving. So, in this case, if the player has something to the left and right of them, both sides of them, we don't need to check if these are going to squish the player if they are not moving. This saves up a whole lot of resources and coding technicalities because we can just rule out any object that isn't going to logically squish the player based on their current collision. So the first thing the code needs to do is check everything that is colliding with the player at the current time of game. This is very easy, we just check for any collisions with the player. If we do, we add these to a list. This is a list of a custom class object. This contains the current game object we have been colliding with, any contact points, if the contact point is above, below, to the left or right of the player, and any moving scripting. This is basically any script that would move an object, since all objects are moved highly manually with a moving object script or a different setup of scripting that would move an object. For example, falling object scripting, follow scripting, basically anything that moves a thing. For testing where the object is colliding with the player, this is very simple. We check the contact points of this object with the player. Some object, for example, if we are pressed into the bottom corner of a collider, we will be colliding on the left and also the bottom of the player, so we need to check both of these collision points. We just check every place the player is colliding with an object. And then it's just very simply checking if this current collision point is above or below the player, or to the left or right of the player. This is just checking if the X or Y position of the collision point is more than the player's X or Y collision point from the base of the player. If we have multiple collision points, this would have two values being true, so we just check that the top collision would be true, or the bottom collision would be true, or the left or right collision would be true, based on where the object is colliding with the player. Since these are all class objects, we will either update or remove these based on the collision with the player. If the player has a class object that they have already had in their list of class objects, as in an object we're colliding with, and the player is no longer colliding with this object, we will remove it from our list. The same if an object is not in our list and we have started to collide with it, we will add an object information to our list, and for any object information that we are still colliding with after they have been added to our list, we will update these as the player moves along them, because collision information can change. After this, we check if these objects have any velocity in their movements. If an object doesn't have any velocity, it is either not moving or it doesn't have any scripting that would move the object. This is using a function class, so if the object doesn't have any scripting that would make it move, we just return that there is no scripting. If it does have an object that would make it move, we return whatever the velocity of this object is. This is why, in the previous devlog, when I talked about moving platforms, I made very clear that the moving platform velocity finder was useful in other scriptings. This is what it's used for. In all of my moving scripting that would move an object, I have a function that returns how fast the object is moving and in what direction the object is moving. So we read what is moving and we read what direction the object is moving in. It is then just a simple process of checking in this direction, either on the x-axis or y-axis. If we're moving on the x or y-axis, if we're moving on both of these axes, we're going to check both of these axes for collision on both of these axes, because that's the easiest way to do it. And if there is any collision, we will squish our player. Now, I'm obviously going to talk very in-depth about how this works, but in basic it's a very simple setup of just, is the player touching a moving object? Is the moving object moving in a way that is touching the opposite side of the player? Kill player! Anyway, let's talk in depth about how it works for a really long time. The easiest way to do this is with an example. Let's say we have an object to the left of the player that is moving right. This is going to collide with the player and return information that this object is moving to the right and is colliding with the player on the left. This is important because, for example, if we are colliding with an object that is below our character, let's say we're standing on a moving object, we won't need to check for any collision with this if this object is not moving up. Because this object is below the player and is not moving up, we will therefore not have any issue with collision, because if there's any object moving that hits the player, even above us, we're not going to get squished. If there's any object that hits the player to the right, we're not going to get squished because we're on a moving object that is moving to the right, but is not towards our left. So we first have to check that the moving object has collision in the opposite direction of its movements. Then, very simply, we want to check if we have any collisions with an object that is not our moving object, and is on the opposite side of the moving object's collision. If the object is to the left of us and is moving to the right, we'll have to check if there's any collision objects in our big old list towards the right of the player. That is very simple, just run a list of every single object we are colliding with, check if these objects are not also moving to the right, so therefore there won't be any overlap of squishing, but that's incredibly unlikely. That is in the case if you are moving between two objects and they're both equally moving at the same speed towards the right and won't squish you, but again, that's not really going to happen in any level design or scripting because it's highly unlikely and highly specific, so don't worry about that happening. It's just a check to make sure if it does happen, there isn't an issue. And then, if this all returns true, meaning there is an opportunity for squishing, we will then engage in a squish the player function, which just kills the player and plays a unique effect. The limitations of this function are that it only uses a 4-directional input, being top, bottom, left and right, and is not based on the actual direction of the moving object. So if it's moving diagonally at an angle, we're going to check both upwards or horizontally and vertically as it's moving diagonally. This just made it a lot easier for coding, level design, collision detection, things like that. If I was actually detecting angles of things based on movement, it would get a whole lot more complicated, and if I'm being completely frank with you, which is an idiom meaning honest, it's not needed. Even slightly. This detects collision just fine, it does not need to be more precise than this. Don't worry about it. But that is the entirety of the system. This was really complicated to set up, but now that I've set it up, it's very simple to explain and recreate. It's just checking if there is any collision in the direction of movement. If the movement object is also towards the opposite direction, then we need to check the collision for. Finally, we have the visual effects for how this works. Mwah! I love this. So good. Very nice looking. The only difference to this, of the actual regular effect, is I don't have the player's body parts blast off as they are killed when they usually die. This is for multiple reasons, first being that I wanted a unique visual effect for the player dying in such a way. The second being that if the player is being squished by an object, the body parts would also be squished and clipping into objects as the player is squished. So I want to avoid such a visual thing. It's not a huge issue because these are just visual objects and who cares if they clip into things, but just from a polished perspective of the game looking nice and feeling nice, I want to avoid anything that is going to likely clip into an object. Then if the player is wearing armor while this plays, the armor is going to still play its breaking effect because the player is being killed through that armor. But this is the visual animation for the player being squished by an object. There are two of these, horizontally and vertically, but they're pretty much the same thing. It's the player being squished very, very flat, like a little piece of paper, like in a funny cartoon, which is very easy to do because the player is a two-dimensional plane. I just had to make them look even flatter, which honestly was kind of a challenge. I mostly just squished the object to look like they were flattened, and then they flutter down like a little piece of paper. There is an issue of clipping with this animation where the player can flutter into objects, but it's a 1-second animation that is being visually obscured by transition effects, so in my testing, this isn't really a thing that comes up much and is not really that much of an issue, I think. And in terms of the player having the same visual effect of being squished and having those objects clip into things. I think this is the lesser of two evils, which is an idiom that means that it is the better of two negative options. Anyway, the animation looks nice. I like how this looks. It's just a nice little wiggle with the character's limbs. There is some nice weight or fluttery nature to them going back and forth. This is just giving the visual illusion of the player fluttering in the wind. It's very simple. It's a very simple animation. It's very simple and easy looking, and it's very simple and easy to animate like this. But I think it's satisfying and looks nice. I do want to have more unique death animations in game. They're just kind of hard to set up for. The summing up section of the devlog. I think this was a very fun system to program for. I'm very proud of how well it turned out, and it's also a fun and useful system to have in game. Since I use my own programming for character collision and character movements, in fact even the default ones have issue with this, it's a bother to check if the player is being squished by an object, because there is a lot of different checks you have to do for different game systems. You have to check, well, I made a video about it just now. You know why it's a bother. You have to check if things are colliding in a way that would actually squish the player. Obviously it's useful, so the player isn't clipped into an object, but it's mostly just a bother to create for. Luckily, when coding moving objects, I kept this in mind. I designed the moving objects in a specific way, so I could easily check them for if they are going to squish or collide with the player. So this made the future-proofing of adding collision detection and squishing to these moving objects incredibly simple, because I already had a in-place function for checking which direction of the object is going to be moving in. What I'm saying is, I'm very prepared and very smart and very clever. I'm oh so clever, and I have a big old brain. I'm just so cool and also sexy and intelligent. How did I get this big old brain in my head? How did I do such a thing? Bye. Devlog over.